The crash that changed. Formula One forever. May 1st, 1994. Imola, Italy. The sky is the color of old marble, pale, still, and indifferent. The San Marino Grand Prix is supposed to be a celebration. Formula One is the fastest motorsport on Earth, a cathedral of speed, where engineers and drivers push physics to its absolute limit. 30,000 people have come to watch the cars blur past at over 200 miles per hour. By sundown, the world will be different. Ayrton Senna is in the Williams-Renault, pole position, as expected. He has been the greatest driver on the planet for the better part of a decade. 3 world championships, 65 pole positions, a reputation for something the sport had never quite seen before. A man who seemed to exist on a different plane from everyone else on the grid, operating with a precision that his peers could only describe in hushed, slightly awed tones. He would not survive the afternoon. But this story does not begin on May 1st. It begins years earlier, in the slow accumulation of decisions, pressures, and warnings that made what happened at Imola not just a tragedy, but an inevitability. To understand what Formula One was in 1994, you have to understand what it had been before. The 1970s and early 1980s were a time when death was simply part of the contract. Drivers died in their cars with a kind of regularity that, by today's standards, seems almost incomprehensible. Emerson Fittipaldi once said that every driver of that era had quietly written their own obituary in their mind. It was the price of entry. The sport was addicted to speed and allergic to sentiment, and the men who raced in it understood on some level that they were gambling with their lives every single Sunday. Then came the mid-1980s, and something shifted. Technology had advanced in ways the safety infrastructure never anticipated. Ground effect aerodynamics, turbocharged engines producing over 1,000 horsepower in qualifying trim, monstrous, barely controllable things that made the cars faster than the circuits were ever designed to contain. The FIA, Motorsport's governing body, began a slow, grinding process of regulation. By the turn of the decade, turbo engines were gone. Then active suspension. Then traction control. One by one, the electronic aids that had allowed drivers to coax impossible performance from their machines were stripped away. By 1994, Formula One was supposed to be simpler, purer, safer. The drivers had a different word for it. Michael Schumacher had announced himself to the world in 1991 with a debut that made the paddock go quiet. Quiet in the way that people go quiet when something arrives that they do not quite have the vocabulary to describe. He was with Benetton in 1994, and his Benetton Ford was a machine that several rivals quietly suspected was doing things it was not legally permitted to do. Not loudly, not on the record, but in the garages and in the briefing rooms and over dinner in the evenings, the question circulated: how was Benetton so fast? Schumacher led the championship going into San Marino with 26 points. Senna had 0. Those 2 results were the sum of 3 races. 2 retirements for Senna, mechanical failures, both of them. And Schumacher winning each time with a calm, efficient brutality that made the sport uncomfortable, because it was becoming clear that in the new post-traction control era, something had shifted in the balance of power, and the shift felt wrong to the people who had built their understanding of Formula One around the assumption that Ayrton Senna was the best driver alive. But there was a more immediate shadow over the weekend at Imola. The weekend had already killed a man before Sunday arrived. Rubens Barrichello, then a 21-year-old Brazilian driving for Jordan, not yet the figure he would later become, went off at the Variante Bassa chicane during Friday practice. His car went airborne, hit the tire barrier, and his body went limp in the cockpit, in the way that bodies go limp when something has gone very wrong. The medical team reached him quickly. He had broken his nose and his arm, and had been briefly unconscious, the result of what investigators described as accidental causes, the car's front wing assembly having deflected over a curb in a way no one had predicted. He would survive. He would recover. He would race again for many more years. But the mood in the paddock on Friday evening was not light. And then came Saturday qualifying. Roland Ratzenberger was Austrian, 33 years old, though for much of his career he had told people he was younger, shaving years off his age, the way that drivers with no money and no connections sometimes do. Because youth implies potential, and potential attracts sponsors. He had spent over a decade climbing the ladder of the sport, competing across the world in different series, grinding through the obscure categories and the underfunded teams that exist below the surface of what casual fans ever see. He had only made his Formula One debut that very season, and Imola was only his second race weekend. He was in a Simtech, a small, underfunded team racing at the back of the grid with equipment that was already operating at the edge of its design tolerances. On his flying lap, the front wing failed. The wing, a carbon fiber aeroplane part mounted low and forward on the car to generate downforce, had been damaged earlier in the session. The damage was visible. Whether it was seen, and seen clearly enough to justify stopping the car, has been debated in the years since. What is known is that Ratzenberger continued, and on the approach to the Villeneuve corner, a fast, sweeping right-hander taken at well over 200 miles per hour. The front wing detached completely. Without downforce, the car had no grip. It went straight. It hit the concrete wall at approximately 314 kilometers per hour. The deceleration force was catastrophic. Roland Ratzenberger was declared dead at the Circuit Medical Center. He was the first driver to die during a Formula One weekend since Elio De Angelis in 1986. Senna walked to the accident site. He did not have to. He chose to. He stood at the place where the wall was broken and the debris was still being cleared, and the people who were there that afternoon described his expression as something they struggled to put into words afterwards. Still. Closed. Like a man standing at the edge of something he had known was coming, but had not wanted to see arrive. He spoke with Professor Sid Watkins, the FIA's medical delegate, a neurosurgeon who had watched Senna race for a decade and had become, over those years, something closer to a friend than a colleague. Watkins told him to stop, to walk away, to go fishing, to go anywhere, to simply refuse to get back in the car. He told Senna that he had won everything there was to win and that there was nothing left to prove. Senna said, "I cannot stop. I cannot." There is no clean way to interpret that sentence. People have tried for 30 years. Some say it was compulsion. Some say it was duty. Some say he already knew something that Sunday morning that he could not bring himself to say aloud. He qualified on pole. He went back to his motorhome. He slept. Race morning, May 1st. The formation lap, the grid, the red lights, 5 lights on, then off. The field launched forward in that particular surge of noise and violence that the start of a Grand Prix produces. A sound like a factory exploding in slow motion, spread across 2 seconds. By the first corner, J.J. Leto's Benetton had stalled on the grid. He sat stationary in the path of the field. Pedro Lamy, in the Lotus behind him, had nowhere to go. The impact launched debris into the crowd. 5 spectators were injured. A police officer was struck. The safety car was deployed. For several laps, the field circled at reduced speed, the race effectively frozen. And then the safety car pulled off, and Formula One returned to real speed. 7 laps. At the Tamburello corner, a high-speed left-hander that the drivers had been raising concerns about for years, a section where the wall was close and the runoff was minimal and the speeds were absolute, the kind of corner that forgave nothing. Ayrton Senna's Williams went straight. Not wide, not a small drift, straight. There was no dramatic moment visible from the trackside cameras, no obvious mechanical failure, no collision, no moment of visible driver error. The car simply stopped turning. It rode over the grass for a fraction of a second, and then hit the concrete wall at a speed that the subsequent investigation estimated at around 191 kilometers per hour. The front right wheel detached on impact and struck Senna's helmet. The car came to rest in a cloud of dust and debris. It sat there in silence. The television director cut away. This was 1994. Onboard cameras existed. The footage existed. Some of it would later be seen, and some of it would not. In the immediate aftermath, the broadcast showed the marshals running, the medical car arriving, the haze of dust still settling around the broken car. Professor Watkins reached the scene and performed emergency medical procedures at the trackside. He would write later, with a precision that made the account almost unbearable to read, that he had known in those moments. He had known. Senna was airlifted to the Maggiore Hospital in Bologna. The race, after a brief red flag, was restarted. This is one of the facts that people struggle with most, not the crash itself, not the physics, but the decision to restart. The fact that while a man was in a helicopter fighting for his life, and the outcome was already known by some of the people who were there, 30 cars were lined up on a grid in Italy and sent racing again. The race was won by Michael Schumacher. At 6:40 in the evening, Ayrton Senna was pronounced dead. The silence that fell over the sport in the days and weeks that followed was the kind of silence that comes when something foundational has been removed without warning. He was 34 years old. Brazil went into 3 days of official mourning. The government declared a national day of grief. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets of São Paulo for the funeral procession, standing in the heat with flowers and flags and expressions of the particular anguish that comes when a national symbol is suddenly, violently, irreversibly gone. Emerson Fittipaldi, himself a 3-time champion, stood at the graveside and could not finish his eulogy. Gerhard Berger, one of Senna's closest friends in the sport, did not race for some time after. He said in later interviews that he had found it impossible to feel connected to what he was doing, that it had stopped making sense temporarily, that he had driven the same circuits and felt the same speed, and it had meant something entirely different than it had before. And across the paddock, quietly, in the engineering rooms, and in the team briefings, in the slow private conversations that follow catastrophe, people began to ask the question that had been circling the sport for years. How long had they known this was coming? The subsequent investigations were exhaustive and, in some respects, deeply unsatisfying. The FIA launched its own inquiry. Criminal proceedings were opened in Italy, a country where causing death through negligence carried serious legal consequences, and where the authorities were not willing to treat what had happened at Imola as simply the acceptable risk of motor racing. Frank Williams and Patrick Head, the principals of the Williams team, were ultimately among those who faced charges. The proceedings lasted years. The final legal outcomes were, in the eyes of many, inadequate to the scale of what had occurred. The technical investigation focused on the steering column. Prior to the race, the Williams FW16 had undergone a modification, not an arbitrary engineering decision, but a specific response to a request from Senna himself. He had complained about the tightness of the cockpit. He wanted more room to steer. To accommodate him, the team cut the column and welded in a smaller piece to alter its length. The very change Senna had asked for to feel comfortable in the car is what the investigation came to believe had killed him. The theory that emerged suggested that the weld had failed under the stresses of a bumpy high-speed corner, causing him to lose control at the precise moment that any loss of control was irrecoverable. Williams disputed this. Others disputed the interpretation of the evidence. The mechanical truth of what happened at Tamburello has never been established with the kind of absolute certainty that would close the question permanently. What was not disputed was the environment in which the accident occurred. Tamburello was a corner that had almost killed Gerhard Berger in 1989, when a fire broke out and his car sat against the barriers in the early moments after the impact. Nelson Piquet had crashed there. Michele Alboreto had crashed there. The drivers had said for years that the corner was dangerous, that the wall was too close, that there was nowhere to go if something went wrong. The corner was modified after 1994. It no longer exists in the form it took that day. It no longer needed to. The 1994 season continued because it had to, because the commercial machinery of Formula One does not stop when people die, and because the 20 drivers who remained on the grid had made the particular calculation that people in dangerous professions make when a colleague does not come home. But it was not the same sport. Within months, the FIA had begun the most comprehensive safety overhaul in the history of the championship. The Technical Working Group, a committee that brought together engineers, medical staff, and track designers, began a systematic review of every aspect of the sport from the cockpit to the circuit. Gravel traps were redesigned. Hans devices, a head and neck restraint system that many drivers had resisted wearing, were eventually made mandatory. Cockpit sides were raised. The survival cell requirements were strengthened. Tire regulations were changed. The cars became slower, and then, in time, found new ways to become fast. But the architecture of safety had been irreversibly altered. Bernie Ecclestone, who controlled the commercial rights of the sport, with an authority that had no clean precedent in professional sport, admitted in later years that what happened at Imola had changed his understanding of what he was running. He was not, by nature or reputation, a man given to public introspection. The admission, when it came, carried a particular weight. Max Mosley, then president of the FIA, drove the safety reforms with an intensity that surprised people who had known him primarily as a political operator. He would later say that the deaths of Senna and Ratzenberger had made him understand that the previous approach to safety, incremental, reactive, negotiated against commercial and competitive interests, was morally indefensible, that the sport had been trading lives against spectacle, and that the trade had to end. In the 3 decades since 1994, no driver has died in a Formula One car during a race weekend. This fact is the most complicated legacy of that Sunday afternoon in Imola. The safety reforms worked. They worked comprehensively, durably, and in ways that saved lives that we cannot count and cannot name, because those drivers are still alive and still racing, and we do not know what would have happened in a different universe where Tamburello still existed in its original form. But the reforms were reactive. They came after the bodies. They came after 2 men died in a single weekend. They came after years of warnings that were absorbed into the system and metabolized and treated as the acceptable friction of a sport that had always operated at the edge of what was survivable. There is a photograph taken at the 1993 Australian Grand Prix, the last race of that season, and it turned out the last race of Senna's life in the car he actually wanted to drive. He had just won the race. He is sitting in the cockpit in the seconds after the car has stopped, and his expression is not what you would expect from a man who has just won. It is not triumph, exactly. It is something quieter. The look of a man who has arrived somewhere and is already thinking about the distance to the next place. He had agreed to drive for Williams for 1994, believing it was the team that could finally make him dominant again after his years at McLaren. He believed in the car. He believed in the team. He was optimistic in the particular way that deeply competitive people are optimistic, not about life in general, but about the specific project in front of them. He had also, in the weeks before his death, spoken privately about fear. Not the free-floating fear of a man losing his nerve, but the specific, informed fear of a racing driver who understood the mechanical environment he was operating in and had identified something that concerned him. He had mentioned the car's handling characteristics at high-speed corners. He had mentioned the feeling of operating at the edge of what the chassis could do. He had not quit. He had not walked away. He had done what racing drivers do, which is to absorb the information and continue forward and trust that the people around him were managing the risk. Whether they were is a question that courts and engineers and historians have argued for 30 years without arriving at a conclusion that satisfies everyone. On the wall at the Tamburello corner, there is a small memorial. Flowers, photographs, the gradual accumulation of things left by people who drive to Imola from places near and far, because they want to stand at the place where something ended, and they cannot entirely explain why that matters to them, only that it does. Motorsport continued. It found new heroes. It produced new championships, new rivalries, new defining moments. Michael Schumacher won 7 world championships. Then came Alonso, Hamilton, Vettel, Verstappen, names that the sport built its next decades around. But in the paddock, among the people who were there in 1994 and are still there now, there is a particular quality to the silence when the conversation approaches that weekend, a particular understanding of what the sport was before and what it became after. Not better or worse in any simple moral calculation, but different, permanently, irreversibly different. There is a recording from the radio system at Williams, made in the first seconds after Senna's car hit the wall at Tamburello. The engineers in the garage heard the data cut out, the telemetry that streams from the car to the computers in real time, 60 parameters updating hundreds of times per second. And they knew what a data cut meant. They stood in silence around the screens. The data cut is still the loudest thing about that afternoon. Everything after it was just the world adjusting to a shape it had not expected to find itself in. Ayrton Senna, 1960-1994. Roland Ratzenberger, 1960-1994. They are still missed by people who never met them. And the corner where it ended has been gone for 30 years. But the question it left behind has not.